the dying cowboy, but the Apache woman's whisper brought him back to life. The land stretched endlessly in every direction, a mixture of dry grass, scattered shrubs, and rocky patches. The wind moved steadily across the desert, carrying with it the scent of dust and earth baked dry under the relentless sun. In this lonely expanse, a solitary figure moved slowly, barely noticeable against the sweeping landscape. He was a cowboy, tall and rugged, with a weathered hat that shaded his face and a coat that had seen better days. His boots were scuffed, his clothes worn, and his skin was tanned and rough from years of exposure to the harsh sun. Every step he took seemed heavy, as if the earth itself weighed him down. He rode a horse that matched him in endurance. The animal's ribs were visible beneath its coat, and its hooves had worn pads from miles traveled on rocky ground. The cowboy had been on the trail for days, perhaps even weeks. He had been traveling alone, as he often did, preferring solitude over company. There was a quiet dignity in his isolation, a way of life that had been passed down from generations before him. Cowboys were meant to be tough, to endure, and to face the world without complaint. Yet even the strongest man could feel the limits of his body and mind, and the cowboy was beginning to sense those limits now. He had set out with a purpose, though the reason had long faded in his memory. Perhaps it had been work, perhaps it had been adventure, or perhaps it had been a search for something he could not name. He had left behind towns and people, leaving the noise and chaos of human life for the quiet rhythm of the plains. In the distance, jagged hills rose up against the horizon, their peaks casting shadows that stretched across the desert floor. The cowboy had ridden toward them, hoping they might offer some shelter or water, but the journey was slow, and his body protested every mile. The horse stumbled over a loose stone, and the cowboy instinctively tightened his grip on the reins. He winced, feeling a sharp pain in his side, a reminder of a fall from days before. That accident had left him bruised and weary, but he had kept moving, driven by stubbornness and a determination to survive. The heat of the sun was relentless, and sweat poured down his face, soaking the collar of his coat. His throat was dry, and he had long since drained the last of his water supply. Even the bread he had packed had become dry and hard, almost impossible to chew. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, and fatigue weighed on him like a heavy blanket. As he pressed on, the land seemed to stretch endlessly, unchanging and unforgiving. He scanned the horizon for any sign of life, any indication of a stream or a patch of shade, but there was nothing. Only the occasional buzzard circled overhead, and the wind whispered through the sparse trees and tall grasses. The cowboy knew the dangers of this wilderness. Snakes hid beneath rocks, the sun could burn a man to exhaustion, and the nights were bitterly cold. Yet he had chosen this path, drawn by a need to test himself, to see how far he could go, and perhaps to find something he had lost long ago, peace, or perhaps a sense of purpose. Hours passed slowly. The sun climbed higher, its heat growing more intense, until it seemed to pierce through the cowboy's skin. His horse slowed to a weary trot, its movements heavy and labored. The cowboy felt a strange emptiness in his chest, a mixture of fear and loneliness. He had spent his life on the move, yet moments like this reminded him that even the strongest heart could falter. He thought of the small towns he had passed, the people he had met, and the friends he had lost along the way. They seemed distant now, like shadows from another life, almost unreal in their warmth and familiarity. Out here, in the vast emptiness, he felt completely alone. The cowboy tried to push his doubts aside, focusing instead on the rhythm of his horse's hooves against the dry earth. Each step was a reminder of the journey he had taken, the miles he had endured, and the strength he still possessed. Yet despite his determination, his body was beginning to give out. A sharp pain in his leg reminded him of an old injury, and his arms felt weak from holding the reins. His vision blurred slightly, and he realized that dehydration was taking its toll. The world around him seemed to shimmer in the heat, the distant hills bending and shifting like waves in a restless sea. He stopped briefly near a rock formation, hoping to find a small shadow of relief. He leaned against the rough stone, letting his horse graze on the sparse grass nearby. The horse's eyes were heavy, and it seemed to understand the cowboy's exhaustion, offering a quiet companionship that was almost comforting. The cowboy's hands shook as he reached into his coat for what little food he had left. A small piece of bread and a few dried fruits were all that remained. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, knowing it might be the last sustenance he had for hours. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying with it a faint scent of sage and wildflowers. It was a subtle reminder that life existed even in this harsh environment. The cowboy closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the dry, fragrant air. He thought about the endless journeys he had taken, the nights under starlit skies, and the early mornings when the world was silent except for the whispers of the wind. These memories were comforting, yet they also reminded him of the fragility of life. Out here in the heart of the desert, one misstep, one accident could mean the end, and he knew deep down that his time might be coming soon. As the afternoon sun began its slow descent, shadows stretched across the plains, and the temperature dropped slightly, offering some relief. The cowboy urged his horse forward once more, knowing he had to keep moving. He could not afford to stop completely. The desert waited for no one, and danger was never far. He navigated around jagged rocks and over dry creek beds, feeling the uneven ground beneath his horse's hooves. Every step was a challenge, yet he pressed on, driven by sheer willpower and the stubbornness that had carried him through countless hardships before. By evening, the horizon glowed with shades of orange and purple. The cowboy paused to watch the sunset, its beauty a stark contrast to the harshness he had endured. In that moment, he felt a strange mix of awe and despair. The desert was unforgiving, but it was also alive with its own quiet magic. The colors, the wind, and the vast emptiness reminded him that he was part of something much larger than himself. Yet, as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, he realized just how vulnerable he was. The night would bring cold, shadows, and more challenges, and he was far from any help. He found a small cluster of rocks and decided to rest nearby. He untied his horse, allowing it to graze while he examined his own injuries. His side throbbed with pain, and his leg ached with each movement. Still, he forced himself to sit upright, tending to the worst of the bruises with what little supplies he had. A small cloth, a bit of water, and careful hands were all he had to offer himself. The cowboy knew that he needed to conserve energy, yet the thought of falling asleep in the open desert was frightening. Predators, the cold, and sheer exhaustion were constant threats. As night settled over the plains, the cowboy leaned back against a large rock, letting the quiet of the desert envelop him. The stars shone brightly, and the moon cast a soft, silver glow over the land. He felt the isolation deeply, yet he also felt a strange connection to the world around him. The desert was alive, not with the noise of people, but with the rhythm of nature itself. The wind whispered through the grasses, the distant cry of an owl echoed across the plains, and the earth seemed to breathe beneath him. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening, feeling, and reflecting on the life that had led him to this lonely spot. Despite his exhaustion and the growing fear of what might come next, the cowboy did not give up. He had faced challenges before, survived storms, injuries, and hardship, and he believed he could endure this as well. Yet deep inside, he sensed that this journey would test him like never before. The desert was merciless, and the solitude pressed heavily upon him. The cowboy understood that the coming days might decide whether he would continue on this earth or become just another forgotten story in the vast expanse of the plains. With a final deep breath, he settled in for the night, his horse resting nearby. The desert stretched on endlessly, silent and eternal, yet filled with the promise of life, danger, and discovery. The cowboy knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but he also knew that the strength within him, the lessons of his past, and the resilience he had developed over years of hardship would guide him through. He closed his eyes, hoping for a brief moment of rest, unaware that soon, a mysterious encounter would change everything, giving him a chance at life he had almost lost. The cowboy woke to a strange quiet that felt heavier than usual. The wind had stopped blowing, and the desert around him seemed frozen in place. His horse stood close, its head bent to nibble on a patch of dry grass, but even the animal seemed aware that something was different. The sun was higher in the sky than when he had rested, and already the heat pressed down, unforgiving and relentless. The cowboy tried to move, but pain shot through his side and leg, reminding him of the fall he had suffered days ago. Every breath felt heavy, and the world around him spun slightly, as if the desert itself were swaying. He pushed himself to sit upright, leaning against a rock for support. His head was light, and his vision blurred. The water he had carried was long gone, and the few scraps of food he had left had been consumed. Hunger and dehydration gnawed at his body, weakening him with every passing hour. He felt a cold fear creeping into his chest, a sensation he had not experienced in years. The cowboy had always believed he could survive anything, that he was stronger than the desert, stronger than the hardships of life. Yet now, in the vast emptiness, he realized how fragile he truly was. The heat seemed to burn through his skin, and sweat ran down his face in thick streams. His clothes were soaked, and his muscles ached from the constant strain. Each movement was an effort, and he began to wonder if he would even be able to stand again. The horse whinnied softly, as if sensing his weakness, and nuzzled his shoulder gently. The cowboy reached out, brushing a hand against the animal's neck, finding a small comfort in its warmth. Despite the pain and fear, the connection with his horse reminded him that he was not entirely alone. As he struggled to rise, the memories of his past began to haunt him. He thought of his family, people he had loved and lost, and friends who had long disappeared from his life. These memories were bittersweet, bringing both comfort and sorrow. He remembered the laughter of his younger days, the excitement of riding through open fields with no care in the world. He remembered the mistakes he had made, the people he had hurt, and the opportunities he had lost. These recollections made him feel a strange mixture of regret and longing. It was as if his life flashed before his eyes, reminding him of everything he had fought for and everything he had taken for granted. The hours passed slowly, and the sun climbed ever higher. The cowboy's strength waned with each step he tried to take. He stumbled over rocks and dry grass, barely able to keep his balance. His side throbbed sharply, making it difficult to breathe deeply. His mouth was parched, and his tongue felt swollen and dry. He tried to call out for help, but his voice came out as a weak, raspy whisper that disappeared into the vast desert. The loneliness pressed down on him, and for the first time, he felt the terrifying possibility that no one would come to find him, that he might simply fade away into the emptiness. He sank to the ground near a small, dry creek bed, hoping to find shade under a lone tree. The branches offered little relief, but he leaned against the trunk, closing his eyes and letting his body rest, even as his mind raced. Thoughts of survival filled his head. He knew he had to find water soon or risk slipping into unconsciousness. Yet his body refused to obey, every movement sending waves of pain through him. The cowboy felt trapped in a cruel cycle. The desert demanded action, but his body demanded rest. Hours seemed like days as he lay there, drifting in and out of awareness. In his half-conscious state, he imagined voices, sounds, and visions. Shadows danced across the ground, twisting into shapes that reminded him of people he had known. He could almost hear the laughter of his younger brother, the comforting words of his mother, and the stern but caring voice of his father. Each memory gave him a spark of warmth, yet it also deepened the despair. He was far from those he loved, and the harsh desert threatened to erase him entirely. As evening approached, the temperature dropped slightly, offering a brief reprieve. The desert, which had been scorching during the day, became sharp and biting at night. The cowboy shivered, his weakened body struggling to maintain warmth. He wrapped his coat tightly around himself, though it offered little protection against the cold wind that swept across the plains. He could see the stars beginning to appear, small points of light in the darkening sky. They reminded him of home, of nights spent under familiar skies, but they also reminded him of how far he was from safety. Exhaustion overtook him, and his thoughts became disjointed. He could no longer think clearly, his mind drifting between memories, hallucinations, and the reality of his situation. He imagined himself lying in a warm cabin, a fire crackling nearby, a hot meal on the table. Then just as quickly, he remembered the stark desert around him, the emptiness, and the danger that threatened every living thing. Fear gripped his chest tightly, making it hard to breathe. The cowboy realized that he was facing something he had never faced before, the real possibility of death, not from violence or accident, but from the relentless and indifferent desert itself. The night deepened, and the desert grew silent once more. Even the wind had stopped, leaving only the sound of the cowboy's labored breathing and the occasional rustle of the horse shifting its weight. He tried to call out again, whispering a name he could barely remember, hoping for some miracle. Yet no reply came, and the silence pressed down on him like a heavy blanket. He felt his strength slipping further, his vision narrowing, his mind growing foggy. Every thought required immense effort, every breath was a struggle. In his weakened state, the cowboy began to reflect on his life with a clarity that only comes near the edge of death. He thought about the choices he had made, the people he had ignored, and the opportunities he had missed. Regret washed over him, but with it came understanding. He realized that life was fragile and precious, and that every moment, no matter how small, carried meaning. He thought of kindnesses he had received, friendships that had been brief yet significant, and lessons learned the hard way. These reflections filled him with a strange sense of peace, even as his body weakened further. The cold of night settled fully around him, and his body trembled uncontrollably. The cowboy struggled to remain conscious, knowing that if he drifted too far, he might never wake again. He whispered to himself, repeating memories, prayers, and fragments of songs he remembered from childhood. His voice was barely audible, yet it seemed to carry a determination that his body no longer possessed. He fought against the darkness, against the pain, and against the despair, clinging to the faint hope that somehow he would survive. Hours passed, though it was impossible to measure time accurately in the desert night. The cowboy felt the world slipping away from him. Shadows lengthened, and his body grew colder. His horse shifted closer, nuzzling his shoulder with concern, a reminder that he was not entirely alone. He reached out weakly, grateful for the small comfort, and felt a spark of life stir within him. That spark was fragile, barely noticeable, but it was enough to keep him clinging to existence. As the first hints of dawn appeared on the horizon, the cowboy sensed a change in the air. The temperature rose slightly, and the desert seemed to awaken once more. Though his body was weak and trembling, his mind felt a faint flicker of clarity. He realized that he had survived the night, though barely, and that the day ahead would bring new challenges. He tried to rise again, feeling the pain and exhaustion still gripping him. The desert was unforgiving, but he had endured the worst hours of night, and that gave him a fragile sense of hope. Though the cowboy's body was broken and his strength nearly gone, something deep inside urged him to keep moving. He knew that he could not remain in one place, that the desert offered no mercy to those who lingered. He pushed himself to sit upright, supporting himself against the rocks, and felt a renewed sense of determination. Though death had come close, he had survived, and that survival, however fragile, reminded him of the resilience he had always carried within. Yet even as he prepared to continue, he felt a strange presence, a whisper carried on the wind that seemed to speak to him in a voice both gentle and firm. He could not understand its origin, but it filled him with a sense of calm he had not felt in days. It was as if the desert itself, which had threatened to take him, was now guiding him toward life. The cowboy did not know what the coming hours would bring, but he understood that someone, was about to change the course of his fate. And deep inside, he felt the first stirrings of hope, fragile but undeniable, that he might survive not just the desert, but the darkness that had nearly claimed him. The first rays of morning stretched across the desert, painting the land in shades of gold and pink. The cowboy lay near the dry creek bed, his body weak and trembling from the previous night. The desert seemed quieter than usual, almost as if it were holding its breath. He tried to sit up, but his arms shook violently, and a sharp pain in his side forced him back down. The thought of another day struggling alone against the desert's harshness filled him with despair. He closed his eyes, expecting nothing but emptiness, when a soft sound reached him. It was faint at first, like the whisper of wind through the grass. Then it became clearer, a gentle voice speaking in words he could not entirely understand. It was melodic, almost musical, carrying a strange rhythm that seemed to flow with the desert itself. The cowboy opened his eyes slowly, scanning the horizon. There, emerging from behind a cluster of rocks and sagebrush, was a woman. She moved with grace and confidence, her presence calm yet powerful. Her hair was dark, flowing loosely across her shoulders, and her eyes shone with a warmth and understanding that immediately drew him in. The woman came closer, her footsteps soft against the dry earth. She carried a small bundle, wrapped in cloth, which she set carefully on the ground beside him. The cowboy tried to speak, to ask who she was, but his voice came out as a weak whisper. She smiled gently, and though he did not understand her words, he felt a strange comfort in her presence. She examined him carefully, her hands moving with skill and precision as she checked his injuries. Her touch was gentle but firm, and for the first time in days, the cowboy felt a sense of hope stir within him. The woman began to work quickly, unraveling the cloth to reveal a small collection of herbs and natural remedies. She crushed the leaves with her fingers, mixing them with water she had brought. The scent was strong but soothing, and she applied the mixture to the cowboy's wounds with careful attention. He winced at first, but then he realized the pain was easing. Her hands moved with confidence, each motion precise and deliberate. The cowboy could feel strength returning to his body, not instantly, but gradually, like a slow tide washing away weakness and despair. As she worked, she continued to speak softly, her voice a steady rhythm that seemed to reach beyond words. Though he did not understand the language fully, the cowboy sensed her meaning. She was not merely tending to his body, she was reaching for something deeper, something within his spirit. It was as if her whispers carried not just healing, but a reminder of life itself, a call to fight against the darkness that had almost claimed him. The cowboy felt a strange warmth in his chest, a spark of energy that had nothing to do with food or water. It was hope, fragile but undeniable. Hours passed as the woman worked, tending to every scrape, bruise, and cut. She showed him how to drink the water slowly to conserve his strength, and even offered him small bites of dried food she had carried. Every motion was gentle, yet every word seemed to carry meaning. The cowboy began to respond, his body slowly regaining strength. The color returned to his face, his breathing became steadier, and the trembling in his hands eased. He realized that he had been on the edge of death, and yet here, through her care, life was returning to him. The cowboy tried to speak again, this time with more strength. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice still hoarse but more coherent. The woman smiled softly, nodding as if acknowledging his question, though her words were in her own language. She gestured to herself and then to him, making it clear that she had come to help. The cowboy understood immediately. Despite the language barrier, there was no misunderstanding. She was here to save him, to guide him back from the brink. As the day wore on, the woman did more than just tend to his physical wounds. She taught him how to move gently, how to stretch and massage sore muscles, and how to use the small remedies she had brought. Her patience was remarkable. She never rushed him, never showed frustration at his weakness, and her calm presence seemed to instill courage in the cowboy. For the first time in days, he felt a connection not only to her but to life itself. He realized how close he had been to giving up, how easily death could have claimed him if she had not appeared. The cowboy watched her carefully as she worked. Her knowledge of the land and its resources was profound. She pointed to various plants, explaining their uses with gestures and small demonstrations. The cowboy learned quickly, knowing that this knowledge might one day save him again. It was a lesson in survival, but also a lesson in trust and respect. He felt humbled by her skill and grateful for her presence. She was more than a healer. She was a guide, a teacher, and a guardian in the harsh desert wilderness. As evening approached, the desert's temperature began to drop, and the cowboy felt the first true relief in days. The woman had built a small fire, its warmth inviting after the bitter cold of the night before. She offered him water again, this time showing him how to sip slowly, to let it nourish his body without overwhelming it. He drank carefully, feeling the liquid soothe his parched throat and bring a sense of life back to his muscles. He realized how weak he had become, and yet how strong he was capable of being with the right guidance. The cowboy tried to stand, testing his strength. His legs shook, but the woman remained nearby, her hands ready to support him if needed. He took a few steps, each one a small victory. The desert no longer seemed entirely threatening, for he was no longer alone. Her presence gave him courage, and her knowledge gave him a sense of safety he had not felt in days. He began to feel that perhaps he could survive this journey, not by stubbornness alone, but with care, respect, and guidance. Night fell over the desert once more, but this time it did not bring fear. The cowboy lay near the fire, watching the woman as she moved gracefully among the flames, her movements calm and deliberate. She hummed softly, a tune that seemed to resonate with the desert itself. The cowboy listened, feeling a deep sense of peace. He understood that her whispers were not just words, they were encouragement, wisdom, and the magic of life itself. In that moment, he realized that survival was not just about physical strength. It was about connection, hope, and the willingness to accept help when it was offered. Throughout the night, the woman remained near him, checking his wounds, offering water, and speaking softly. The cowboy drifted in and out of sleep, but he never felt fear. He felt cared for, protected, and gradually, his body began to recover. The pain was still there, but it was no longer overwhelming. He had faced death, and yet here he was, still alive, thanks to the gentle care and wisdom of a stranger who had appeared at exactly the right moment. By morning, the cowboy could move more easily. His strength was still not fully restored, but he could stand without assistance. The woman showed him how to prepare simple remedies from the plants around them, teaching him skills that would aid his survival. She encouraged him to drink water carefully and to rest whenever his body demanded it. The cowboy listened attentively, realizing that he had much to learn, not only about surviving the desert but about life itself. Her lessons were subtle but powerful, reminding him that resilience came not just from stubbornness, but from knowledge, care, and awareness. The cowboy felt a deep gratitude toward the woman. He wanted to thank her, to offer something in return, but words seemed insufficient. Instead, he nodded, his eyes conveying the appreciation and respect he felt. She smiled gently, acknowledging his gratitude without words. It was a silent understanding between them, a bond formed in the quiet strength of the desert. He knew that her help had given him a second chance at life, and that he would carry the memory of her whispers and guidance forever. The rest of the day was spent in quiet preparation. The woman tended to her small fire, gathered herbs, and helped the cowboy regain his strength. They moved slowly together, each step deliberate, each action filled with purpose. The cowboy felt a sense of hope he had not experienced in days. He realized that survival was no longer a solitary struggle. It was now a shared journey, guided by kindness, wisdom, and the gentle power of another human being who understood life in ways he never had. As evening fell, the cowboy looked at the woman with a new sense of respect. She had appeared when he was at his weakest, when death had almost claimed him, and she had guided him back to life. Her whispers, her care, and her wisdom had restored not only his body but his spirit. He knew that he owed his survival to her, and that this encounter would remain with him forever. The desert, once a place of fear and danger, now seemed full of possibility and life, illuminated by her presence and her quiet strength. The days following the cowboy's near-death experience passed slowly, each one blending into the next under the vast, unchanging sky. Though his body was recovering thanks to the Apache woman's care, he knew that true survival required more than just healing. The desert was unforgiving, and he could not rely solely on someone else to keep him alive. He had to learn, to observe, and to understand the land that had almost claimed him. The woman, whose presence had become both guidance and comfort, began to teach him the deeper lessons of survival, not through words alone, but through actions, gestures, and the quiet wisdom that seemed to flow from her very being. Each morning, he awoke before sunrise, the sky glowing faintly with pink and orange streaks. The coolness of dawn was a relief after the scorching heat of the day, and he used these early hours to stretch his stiff limbs and prepare himself for the work ahead. The Apache woman showed him how to find water in unexpected places, small pools hidden under rocks, dew collected on plant leaves, and tiny streams that ran beneath the sand. She demonstrated how to dig shallow holes in the earth to reach moisture, and how to purify it using natural materials. The cowboy listened carefully, observing her movements, repeating them under her watchful eyes, and gradually internalizing her knowledge. She also taught him about food. The desert seemed barren to someone untrained, yet she moved through it with confidence, pointing out edible plants, roots, and berries that he had never noticed before. Each lesson was accompanied by careful explanation, gestures, and patient encouragement. When the cowboy hesitated, uncertain if a plant was safe, she would smile gently, sometimes tasting it first, demonstrating trust in her methods. The cowboy began to realize that survival depended on awareness, patience, and respect for the land, and that brute strength alone was not enough. The physical lessons were only part of the transformation. The Apache woman emphasized the importance of mental and emotional resilience. She encouraged the cowboy to listen to the wind, the animals, and the subtle changes in the desert. "The desert speaks," she seemed to say through her gestures and whispers. "If you listen, it guides you. If you ignore it, it teaches through pain." At first, the cowboy did not fully understand, but as days passed, he began to notice small details. The rustling of the grasses signaling approaching weather, the tracks of animals hinting at nearby water sources, and the smell of the earth indicating hidden dangers. These lessons were subtle yet profoundly powerful. Despite the slow recovery, the cowboy found himself tested again. One morning, as they moved toward a small canyon in search of water, his leg, still weak from injury, gave way. He stumbled, barely keeping his balance, and a sharp pain shot through his side. He fell to the ground, frustrated and ashamed. The woman knelt beside him immediately, her eyes filled with concern, yet she did not scold or show impatience. Instead, she guided him to rest, whispered words of reassurance, and demonstrated the proper way to support his body while moving. Through her care, he realized that struggle was not a sign of weakness. It was an essential part of growth, a lesson the desert demanded from those who dared to survive within it. As he regained his strength, the cowboy also learned the importance of rhythm and routine. The Apache woman moved with a natural flow, her actions in harmony with the cycles of the desert. She rose with the sun, gathered supplies, and taught him tasks in a deliberate sequence that made each day manageable. The cowboy began to mimic her habits, understanding that endurance required both discipline and attentiveness. He learned to ration water, to rest during the hottest hours, and to use the cool mornings and evenings for travel and work. Slowly, he began to feel a sense of control over his life once more, a feeling he had not experienced since before the accident. One afternoon, the cowboy spotted a small herd of deer in the distance. The Apache woman gestured for him to watch silently. She showed him how to track the animals without disturbing them, how to read the signs in the sand and grass, and how to anticipate their movements. It was a lesson in patience, observation, and understanding the rhythms of nature. The cowboy felt a deep respect for the creatures and the land that supported them. It was a humbling realization. Survival was not simply taking what he needed, but learning to coexist with the world around him, to move in harmony rather than against it. The cowboy's recovery was not without moments of doubt. There were times when his body still ached, when hunger gnawed sharply, and when the desert seemed to stretch endlessly, testing his patience and resolve. In those moments, he would hear the Apache woman's soft whispers, and her presence alone brought him comfort. She would place a gentle hand on his shoulder, offer a sip of water, or simply nod in encouragement. Slowly, he learned to trust not only her guidance but his own instincts, understanding that he was capable of more than he had believed. Each step, each small success, strengthened his body, mind, and spirit. The nights were equally instructive. The Apache woman showed him how to build safe shelters from the sparse materials available, how to tend a small fire, and how to stay warm in the desert's sudden chill. She encouraged him to observe the stars, teaching him to navigate by their positions and the movement of the moon. The cowboy marveled at her knowledge, realizing that the desert was not just a place of hardship, but a place of learning and wisdom. With every night spent under the sky, he grew more attuned to the land, more aware of its subtleties, and more confident in his ability to survive. Over time, the bond between the cowboy and the Apache woman deepened. Though they spoke different languages, communication flowed through gestures, expressions, and shared experience. They moved together as a team, supporting one another in small ways that mattered greatly. The cowboy began to feel a sense of gratitude that went beyond mere survival. He felt respect and admiration for the woman who had saved his life and guided him back from the brink. Her whispers, gentle and persistent, had become a lifeline, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, compassion and knowledge could sustain life. One day, as they rested near a small, hidden stream, the cowboy reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He realized that his near-death experience had transformed him. He was no longer just a lone traveler fighting against the desert. He had become a learner, a student of the land, and someone capable of growth and understanding. The struggle had taught him patience, humility, and the value of connection. He understood that life was fragile, yet resilient, and that survival depended not only on physical strength but on awareness, wisdom, and trust. The Apache woman continued to guide him, teaching him how to prepare simple meals from plants, how to treat minor injuries, and how to conserve energy while traveling long distances. Each lesson was a step toward independence, a reminder that he was not helpless, but capable when equipped with knowledge and patience. The cowboy practiced diligently, learning from mistakes, observing carefully, and growing stronger with each passing day. He felt a new sense of confidence, a belief that he could face the desert on his own if necessary, though he knew he would always carry the lessons of her guidance. As the days turned into weeks, the cowboy's body and spirit grew stronger. His injuries healed, his muscles regained strength, and his mind became sharper and more aware of the world around him. The desert, once a symbol of danger and despair, now seemed full of life and possibility. He could read the signs of animals, the shifts in weather, and the subtle cues in the land that had once gone unnoticed. He had learned to move with care, to rest when needed, and to respect the balance of nature. Most importantly, he had learned that survival was not about isolation or stubbornness. It was about learning, adapting, and accepting help when offered. By the end of this period of recovery, the cowboy stood taller, his movements confident and sure. He had faced the edge of death, learned from the desert, and grown in ways he had never imagined possible. The Apache woman had guided him not only back to life, but toward understanding the deeper lessons of endurance, respect, and connection. The cowboy felt a profound sense of gratitude, knowing that he had been given a second chance, and that the whispers, guidance, and presence of the woman had been the key to his survival. As the sun rose one morning, casting golden light over the plains, the cowboy prepared to take his first steps toward continuing his journey. He was no longer the weak, near-death traveler who had collapsed days ago. He was stronger, wiser, and more attuned to the world around him. Yet he carried with him a deep sense of humility and respect, understanding that life's challenges could return at any moment. He knew that the lessons he had learned would guide him forever, and that the bond he had formed with the Apache woman would remain a source of strength and inspiration. The morning sun stretched over the plains, painting the land with soft shades of gold and amber. The desert seemed calm, almost welcoming, a stark contrast to the harsh, unforgiving place it had once felt. The cowboy stood beside his horse, now strong and steady, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. His body was fully recovered, his wounds healed, and his muscles regained strength. But it was more than his body that had changed. His spirit, his understanding, and his perspective on life had been transformed through the lessons, care, and presence of the Apache woman who had saved him. He looked around the desert with new eyes. What had once seemed like an endless, lifeless expanse now appeared full of subtle signs of life. Tiny plants pushed through cracks in the earth, birds flitted between the sparse trees, and even the wind carried a gentle rhythm, whispering stories of the land. The cowboy understood that the desert had never been his enemy. It had tested him, challenged him, and brought him to the brink of death, but it had also taught him resilience, patience, and respect. The land was alive, and he was now a part of it, connected in ways he had never imagined before. The Apache woman approached, her movements as graceful and confident as ever. She carried a small bundle of herbs and water, her eyes calm and wise. The cowboy turned to her, gratitude shining in his gaze. Words felt inadequate for the depth of what he wanted to express, but he managed a nod, a smile, and a simple, "Thank you." She smiled in return, understanding fully without words. Their bond needed no language. She had restored his life, taught him how to survive, and shown him the strength of patience, awareness, and humility. The cowboy began to prepare for his departure. He packed his few belongings carefully, tending to his horse and checking his supplies. Every item had a purpose, every motion deliberate. The Apache woman watched quietly, offering occasional guidance when needed. She had taught him how to ration food and water, how to recognize the signs of the desert, and how to use the land to sustain himself. These lessons were invaluable, not only for survival, but for the understanding that life itself was fragile yet resilient. The cowboy felt a deep sense of readiness, confident that he could continue his journey, but also humbled by the knowledge he had gained. Before leaving, he took a moment to reflect. He remembered the long hours of struggle, the nights when he had teetered on the edge of life and death, and the whispers of the Apache woman that had guided him back. He thought of the lessons learned, the patience required to observe the land, the care needed to tend to one's own body, the humility to accept help, and the awareness that survival was as much about mental strength as physical endurance. These reflections brought a quiet gratitude, a sense of peace he had never known before. He realized that life was not merely about surviving, but about understanding, learning, and growing from every experience. The cowboy mounted his horse, feeling the steady strength beneath him. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, but he no longer feared it. He had learned to move with the land, to read its signs, and to respect its power. Every step forward was deliberate, thoughtful, and full of awareness. As he rode, he glanced back at the Apache woman. She watched him with a calm and serene expression, her presence a silent blessing on his journey. Though their paths would soon diverge, her influence would remain with him forever, guiding his steps, shaping his thoughts, and reminding him of the fragility and beauty of life. Along the way, the cowboy encountered familiar challenges, the rocky terrain, the shifting sands, and the scorching sun, but he faced them differently now. He moved with patience, observing the land, adjusting his pace, and making choices guided by awareness rather than desperation. The lessons of survival she had taught him were now second nature. He found water and food with ease, treated minor injuries with confidence, and respected the land as a partner rather than an adversary. Each success, no matter how small, reinforced his belief in his own strength and the wisdom of the guidance he had received. During one particularly quiet afternoon, the cowboy stopped at a small stream to rest. He dismounted and allowed his horse to drink, watching the sunlight sparkle on the water. He thought of the nights he had spent near similar streams, weak and near death, and felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The memory of struggle was still fresh, but it was accompanied by pride and gratitude. He realized that he had not only survived but grown in ways he could never have imagined. The desert, once a symbol of fear, had become a teacher, and he had become a student who had learned its deepest lessons. The cowboy also began to notice the subtle beauty of life around him, the tiny flowers that bloomed in unlikely places, the songs of birds, the rustling of leaves in the wind. These small details, which had once gone unnoticed, now held deep significance. They reminded him that life existed even in the harshest conditions, and that awareness and presence were essential to truly appreciating it. He had learned to look beyond survival, to see life as a series of moments, each carrying meaning and opportunity. As evening approached, the cowboy found a small plateau overlooking the desert. He dismounted and sat down, gazing at the horizon as the sun set in brilliant hues of red and orange. He felt a sense of closure, a feeling that the journey that had begun with near death was now leading him toward renewal and purpose. The struggles he had faced, the lessons he had learned, and the care he had received had changed him profoundly. He understood now that life was fragile, precious, and intertwined with the world around him. Every step he took, every choice he made would carry the weight of this understanding. The Apache woman appeared nearby, watching him quietly. She had guided him, healed him, and taught him, yet she never demanded recognition or praise. Her role had been one of quiet strength, wisdom, and compassion. The cowboy felt a deep sense of respect for her, realizing that her influence had shaped not only his survival, but his perspective on life. He knew that he would carry her lessons forever, not as instructions to follow blindly, but as principles to guide his choices and actions in the world. Before parting ways, the cowboy offered a final gesture of gratitude. He gave her a small token, a piece of cloth he had carried, embroidered with a simple design he had made in her honor. She accepted it with a gentle smile, understanding the meaning without words. Their bond, formed in the crucible of survival, was unspoken yet profound. It was a connection that transcended language, culture, and circumstance, a reminder that compassion and knowledge could shape lives in the most extraordinary ways. As he rode away, the cowboy felt a mixture of emotions, gratitude, awe, humility, and hope. He had faced death, learned from the desert, and been guided back to life by someone who had appeared when he needed help most. His journey was far from over, but he now carried within him a strength that was both physical and spiritual. He understood that challenges would come again, but he felt prepared to meet them with patience, awareness, and respect. The whispers of the Apache woman, gentle and persistent, would echo in his mind, reminding him of the power of life, care, and connection. The desert, once a symbol of fear, now seemed full of possibility. The cowboy moved with confidence, yet he remained humble, aware that life was fragile and that survival depended on wisdom as much as courage. He reflected on the lessons of the past weeks, the importance of observation, the value of patience, the necessity of care, and the power of connection. These principles were no longer abstract ideas, they were lived truths, embodied in the way he moved, thought, and acted. As the days passed, the cowboy continued his journey through the plains, navigating challenges with a newfound understanding. He found water, gathered food, and treated his body with care. The lessons of survival had become second nature, yet he never took them for granted. Each day was an opportunity to practice awareness, patience, and respect. He moved through the desert not as a conqueror, but as a student of life, attuned to the rhythms of the land and guided by the wisdom imparted to him. Eventually, the horizon began to show signs of civilization. Small towns and settlements appeared, signaling the end of his journey through the desert. Yet the cowboy felt no rush to return to the familiar. He knew that the lessons he had learned would guide him in every environment, every encounter, and every choice. The desert had transformed him, teaching him resilience, humility, and the importance of connection. These lessons would remain with him long after the plains faded from view. As he rode into the nearest town, the cowboy looked back at the desert one last time. It stretched endlessly, vast and eternal, yet no longer threatening. It had been a harsh teacher, but one whose lessons had been invaluable. He felt a deep sense of gratitude, not only for the land itself, but for the Apache woman whose guidance had restored his life. Her whispers, care, and wisdom had been the bridge between death and life, fear and hope, weakness and strength. The cowboy understood that his life had been forever changed by this encounter, and he vowed to carry these lessons forward with respect and humility. With the town ahead, the cowboy dismounted and led his horse toward the center of life and activity. He was no longer the near-death traveler who had stumbled through the desert. He was stronger, wiser, and deeply aware of the fragility and beauty of life. The journey had tested him, transformed him, and renewed him. He carried with him not only survival skills, but the understanding that life's greatest strength often comes from compassion, knowledge, and the quiet guidance of those who show up when they are most needed. The cowboy entered the town with a steady gait, his mind clear and his heart full. He knew that his story would continue, but he also knew that the lessons learned in the desert and the care of the Apache woman would remain with him forever. He had been given a second chance, a new beginning, and the understanding that life, though fragile and fleeting, was always worth fighting for. And as he disappeared into the town, his heart carried the whispers of a woman who had saved him, a reminder that even in the harshest of places, life, hope, and humanity could endure.